Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. It's October, and I am back from my little break. I hope that you had a good September. Mine was definitely good, though extremely busy. So I'm glad I took a bit of time off. So for my first episode back, I want to talk about something that's a little bit different from usual, right? So this podcast deals a lot with forgotten history, but I really want to talk about, I guess, what you could call forgotten futures this time. And I also want to talk about Mylar balloons and what they represent in the paranormal and what else they might represent or could represent in terms of our world and our future, etc. So a little bit of background on this. It's been a bit of a weird year for me. I talked a little bit about this in my Randonautica series, how it feels kind of like something weird happened maybe around last August or so, and it feels sort of like I crossed a threshold and just some strange paranormal stuff has happened, but also just like a lot of stuff has happened in my life, mostly for the better. But anytime there's a lot of change, one, that's stressful, and two, it puts you into sort of a liminal space, right? If you're going from one place to another, physically, or in my case, in terms of different parts of my life kind of changing, you of course end up in an in-between place. And I feel like a lot of this year I've been in a weird in-between place, or a liminal place. For me, among many other things, I dealt with this year going from being laid off from my job to being unemployed for a while to deciding to be self-employed. And that's been a really good but weird journey to be on. And kind of in the middle of all of that, I ended up getting COVID in the spring. And I didn't really realize until a couple weeks ago, but I think I've been dealing with a little bit of long COVID. And I think a lot of that has been in sort of like my mental health. I know there's a lot of cases of people having depression and brain fog and that sort of thing after COVID, and I definitely have been feeling that. And just a couple weeks ago, I suddenly started feeling a lot better, and that's what made me realize that perhaps I had been feeling quite bad since April. And the reason why I'm mentioning all of this is because this year, and especially over the summer, while I was recovering from COVID and kind of dealing with the post-COVID lingering effects, I've been trying really, really hard to improve my mental health, or at least, keep things stable. And we're living in this world where it feels like everything is falling apart. You could talk about so many different things, right? Like the cost of living crisis, everything going on politically, environmental issues, and many, many other things. And I've definitely had to shift a little bit of my media consumption and news consumption to give myself the mental space to think something other than we're all screwed, it's the apocalypse, etc. Which, as I'm sure you know, can be very difficult these days, to get your brain off of that track of thinking. And one thing that I've been doing to try to accomplish that is to read and consume media that imagines a better future, or even just, opens up the door a little bit to the possibility of there being a future at all, but in particular, a better future. I've been reading a ton of nonfiction books about the environment, about repairing things, about ways of looking at the world. I've been reading some fiction, in particular, things that fall into the subgenre of science fiction called solarpunk, which maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't, but it's basically work that imagines a better future without crossing that line into utopianism and just writing about sort of like pie in the sky, unrealistic stuff. Instead, a lot of solarpunk books tend to deal with environmental collapse and really bad things happening, but instead of being dystopias, they typically tell the stories of how people can kind of recover from it and build a better society and that sort of thing. There's a ton of stuff that's been written in that genre, and I'm really just barely dipping my toe into it at this point. But if you haven't read anything solarpunk before and you're looking for sort of an easy entry point, I would recommend Becky Chambers' series that begins with a psalm for the wild built. It's her Monk and Robot series. It's extremely accessible because so far the series is just 2 short novellas, and it's really nice because while the books, I think, are engrossing, they are not stressful at all. So they just feel like a nice reprieve from the constant stress of daily life, but also the stress that you sometimes feel while reading. You know, I'm impressed by how well she towed that line between not being stressful while also not being boring. So anyway, that's where my head's been at these last few months. You know, I, of course, am always reading about paranormal topics and stuff, but this year I've read probably like 20 or 30 books about all the stuff I've just been talking about, mostly nonfiction, but a little bit of fiction too. And it was while reading these books that I got the idea for this episode, because I found that Mylar balloons kind of started popping up in these books. And there's one passage in particular where I was listening to an audiobook and I was like, wait a second. And in case you don't know, Mylar balloons feature pretty prominently in the documentary series Hellier, which is a really great paranormal documentary series. You can watch it all on YouTube. I just rewatched it a couple weeks ago for, I want to say, the 7th time. I don't know how many times I've watched it. I've watched it a bunch of times. I always pick up something new every time. But in Hellier, there are a number of synchronicities that occur related to Mylar balloons. In particular, Mylar balloons that are seen kind of randomly out in nature, but that end up being very meaningful. And I think that everyone knows what Mylar balloons are, but if not, they're like the shiny, metallic-looking balloons that you would buy like at the checkout counter at the grocery store. And I know now there's fancy ones where you can buy letters and spell out names using them for parties and stuff. It's a whole thing. But ever since Hellier pointed out synchronicities related to Mylar balloons, I've been kind of hearing about other synchronicities related to Mylar balloons in the paranormal. I can't remember which episode, but I remember in at least one episode of the podcast Strange Familiars, there was a mention of Mylar balloons and synchronicities and there being some kind of significance there. I've seen stuff about maybe there being some sort of connection between Bigfoot and Mylar balloons. I've had my own small synchronicities with Mylar balloons, but nothing that's really worth going into here, though I've mentioned it on past episodes. And I suppose it's also worth mentioning that when I searched Mylar balloon paranormal, there were some results that mentioned that some people mistake Mylar balloons for ghosts, UFOs, and other paranormal phenomena, since they are shiny objects that float around. And, you know, if you see it kind of at a distance or out of context, then you might think it's something else. So I've talked a little bit about Mylar balloons in the paranormal. Now I just want to talk about Mylar balloons as trash. Like I said, I've been reading tons of books about reuse and repair and the environment and stuff like that, and many of them have mentioned Mylar balloons as a common sight when it comes to waste. And I started to think about, what does it mean to be haunted by trash, right? We are all haunted by trash whether or not we know it. I read this really interesting book called Garbology by Edward Humes that talks about, it's exactly what it says on the tin. It is about the study of garbage, and it talks about these dumps and how trash in a lot of these large garbage dumps isn't decomposing the way we thought it would, like even organic trash or, just trash that should be decomposing isn't necessarily or isn't always, because it's literally in some cases being mummified. Like there's not enough oxygen to get in to allow the decomposition process to happen. And there's just all these unexpected things when it comes to what we thought our trash would do after we're done using it and what the actual reality is. And the book is super, super interesting. Talks about instances where dumps have been basically like tapped to get fuel, from the stuff that does decompose, it like off gases, this stuff that can be used for fuel, etc. It's an interesting book, but I just can't get rid of this image of mummified trash and this idea of how our trash does haunt us. There's a lot of stuff that can be said about plastic taking a very, very long time to decompose, basically not decomposing, but I don't really want to get into all of that here. I did, however, want to look at Mylar balloons, this one tiny part of our trash stream or whatever, this one thing that, is used once and then thrown away, but has an impact for a very long time. So I wanted to read the excerpt that got me thinking about all of this. So this is from a book called The Buy Nothing, Get Everything Plan. Discover the joy of spending less, sharing more, and living generously. This is a book by the creators of the Buy Nothing movement, or, like Buy Nothing groups. You're probably familiar with the Buy Nothing Facebook groups. There's probably one for your local area, and you can go on there and people post things they don't need anymore, and then people who do need those things contact them and, get these things for free. And vice versa. And it's basically a really cool gift economy thing. I do use the app a little bit. There's a Buy Nothing app, at least in the United States. And the whole idea of a gift economy is really, really interesting. And it's worth reading this book just to get more on that. But here's the passage I wanted to read, which describes a trip to the beach with this author's family. When we looked more closely at the sand beneath our feet, we found a couple of 3-millimeter wide plastic discs. We later discovered these are called nurdles, and they are industrial feedstock for all plastic products. It soon became clear that the discs made up an alarming percentage of the beachscape that day. As kids ran along the logs, yelling out with glee about their newfound game, refusing to touch the plastic sand with their feet, we trained our gaze to look at what else was commingling with the sand, shells, driftwood, and seaweed around us. We found larger bits of plastic debris that were even more disturbing. Syringes, a green army man that Finn was happy to add to his collection, coffee stirrers, PVC pipe, pens just like Cleo's from home, light switch covers, a Mylar helium birthday balloon like the one that Ava lost at a friend's party when it slipped free from her fingers the week before, cigarette lighters, a bright yellow baby toy just like the one Mira remembered having, car bumpers, and tampon applicators, objects of our everyday lives, all made of plastic, all washed up on our shoreline. So, after reading that and hearing the words Mylar balloon, I wanted to do a bit more digging and see who else was talking about finding Mylar balloons out and about in nature. I've heard the paranormal perspective, I've heard the more environmental type perspective, but I was delighted when I came across a thread on ArizonaHuntingForums.com from March 2022. I like this because it was hunters talking about it, not like hippies or anything. Whatever your stereotypical image of a person who's very concerned with the environment is, this is kind of the opposite of whatever that stereotype is. But I thought they painted a really good picture of what it's like to be in the woods and come across tons of Mylar balloons, because apparently that is a thing. And I did not realize just how common it was. So I'm going to read from this. Here's the original post. A buddy and I went out scouting/shed hunting over the weekend. We saw some great areas that we may hunt come August for bow, but we also saw, and I come across this every time I am in the woods, not one, but 2 Mylar balloons. Ironically, they both said you are special. A special kind of idiot for releasing them into the air. My daughter and her Girl Scout troop have actually been trying to push for legislation to educate and stop the release of balloons into the air as they inevitably find their way into wild places. They were able to take it all the way to the Capitol building, where they spoke on the subject. I guess my point is not really a point, but a venting due to how often I come across this. We collected both balloons and carried them with us through our hike, and then proceeded to collect a trash bag's worth of garbage in the few 100-yard area near where we parked our car, mostly beer cans and bottles. People cannot be bothered to venture deeper into the woods, fortunately, to drink. Nor can they be bothered to collect their trash. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. Who else is encountering these Mylar balloons? And the answer is kind of everybody. I just want to read a few of the replies. I hear you, Robert. Every time I go to the creek to fish, so much trash, hook wrappers, bait jars, lids, worm containers, you get the point. If you carry it in, carry it out. Takes so little time to do it. And yes, I've seen my share of Mylar balloons. Another person says, I found those balloons in the middle of the desert in 28 all the time. They catch your eye easy because the sun reflects off them a mile away. No one bothers to think where they land after being released. Another person says, I did a whole rant on Mylar balloons when posting some hiking photos on another site. I find them in the most remote locations and they never seem to die. They need to be outlawed as a environmental hazard. So at this point, I was kind of starting to laugh because if these comments were in a slightly different context, I would say, oh yeah, these are environmental activists wanting to help, clean up the woods, which is a very noble thing to want. But, these are hunters in Arizona. I wanted to read a little bit more. Well, fellers, here is a point that we are in total agreement. Here on the coast, you can't go to the beach or offshore any distance without finding some sort of released balloon or other such trash. And the worst part is, here on the Gulf, our sea turtles, which are having a hard enough time surviving, come upon these floating balloons and they look just like a jellyfish, which is prime sea turtle food. The poor turtles eat the plastic and they die a terrible death from their guts being clogged with trash. Brothers, you are all singing the right song. These damned balloons ought to be banned and taken off the open market. And this person also was talking about Walmart bags in addition to the Mylar balloons. So another commenter had a good perspective, I thought, on why these balloons are so ubiquitous. So this person says, the thing about the Mylar balloons is that they can get to parts of the planet that Walmart bags are unlikely to. These helium-filled balloons can literally find their way to every nook and cranny of the most remote wilderness areas. It is pretty disheartening to find a spot that may not have seen human foot traffic in 100 years or perhaps much more, but there is a effing Mylar balloon. Another person says, I tend to hike fairly deep into the woods and will always find them. I have yet to go on a hike, scout, hunt, and not come across one, often 2 to 3. Another commenter had something kind of cute to say, which is, I believe picking up Mylar balloons is a good way to turn the luck on a hunting trip for the better. Interestingly, someone chimed in with a creepy Mylar balloon story. So this person says, my spooky Mylar balloon story, and I may have told this before, I don't recall. My son-in-law and I were driving down a Forest Service road at 0:30 on the way to a turkey setup. We are both only about half awake and he's driving. All of a sudden, a flashing sparkly item floats across the road ahead of us about 2 feet off the road surface. I think I spit out coffee, but my comment was, what the hell is that? The thing is flashing like a set of LED light bars on a police car. I'm thinking Roswell, but as we get closer we see it as a half-inflated Mylar balloon floating and rotating in the breeze as it crosses the road. So again, there's just an instance of someone seeing a Mylar balloon, immediately thinking, oh man, is this like an alien? And then thinking, oh right, it's just a balloon. I'll link the thread in the show notes if you're curious and want to read the whole thread. It is very long, and it's just basically all these hunters being like, yep, I see Mylar balloons everywhere. In the woods, while fishing, etc. So I guess Mylar balloons are such a widespread issue and are found so often out and about in nature that there are a lot of websites dedicated to spreading the word about how environmentally damaging they are. There's even one called mylarmistake.com. So my logical brain when I hear this is to say, okay, I still think that synchronicities relating to Mylar balloons can be super, super meaningful. And I'm not trying to say they aren't. But I do think when thinking about the paranormal and thinking about synchronicities, if you find yourself thinking something like, wow, I can't believe I found this Mylar balloon. What are the odds of that? The answer is high. The odds are extremely high. And that doesn't mean that something's not a synchronicity, and it doesn't mean that it's not really interesting and potentially tied to the paranormal, but also there's just a lot of Mylar balloons. And I just think with the paranormal, it's important to know the likelihood of something, because if you're observing a synchronicity, it might feel less and less like a synchronicity the more you realize how commonplace an object is. That being said, things like Hellier, to me, have put forth a really convincing argument for, at least in the context of the stories they're telling, Mylar balloons being tied into the paranormal and into synchronicities that point to strangeness. So I think that from the passages from that hunting forum that I read, you can get a sense of how people who are into exploring the outdoors feel about Mylar balloons. You know, outdoorsmen are not fans, which makes sense. But in addition to these balloons being litter and eyesores and harmful to animals, like the aforementioned turtles, they're also potentially dangerous, which I had no idea about. But I found this CBS News article that was talking about it. And basically, it said that the coating on the balloons, like that metallic coating, conducts electricity. So these balloons can actually cause shorts in transformers. And just by being near a high voltage line, it can melt wires and cause all sorts of issues. So I just want to read a little bit from that article. The California utility reported 80 outages in February involving balloons and 217 in June. Last year, it tallied more than 1,000 outages related to Mylar balloons, including dozens of incidents involving downed power lines. Then the article quotes someone who works at a utility who says, "There have been times when they make contact that there is this gigantic explosion. The supervisor had them come down away from the area, but it could have been really dangerous." And this was about a explosion in July 2017 in Long Beach, near where some crews were working. And the utility First Energy, quote, blames Mylar balloons for more than 200 power outages in 2018 and 2019 across its service area, which includes parts of Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. So that's a significant impact. And after reading all this, I was like, wow, yeah, Mylar balloons, they do seem like a menace. But to loop back about why I am talking about this, I'm not here to add Mylar balloons to the list of things that you're stressed about causing mayhem and havoc in the world. No, I'm bringing this up because in a lot of these books that I've been reading, there's a strong through line of imagination and this idea that imagination is crucial and very powerful when you're thinking about how to make the world a better place. And, you know, I've been reading these books, thinking about Mylar balloons, thinking about imagination, and I realize that if you're listening to this, you're probably someone who has a lot of imagination. And that's because being interested in the paranormal requires imagination. And no, I'm not saying that the paranormal is all made up. That's not what I'm saying there. Rather, I'm trying to make the argument that the paranormal and the occult is all about things that are at work in this world that we can't see, and they're about an alternate way of experiencing reality. So, of course, this is related to imagination. If imagination is about being able to go beyond what's in front of you and think about something new and different. When it comes to the paranormal, you have the whole world telling you that the only things that are real are what you can see and measure. But the paranormal is all about the things that are harder to measure scientifically or harder to explain or just out of sight and are accessed through unusual means. So you have to have a lot of imagination and a lot of vision to have the courage to consider that there's something else out there. And I would also argue that if you are interested in history, you have a lot of imagination as well, because to study history and to learn about history, you have to be able to imagine things being different from how they are now. And so much about the study of history is about these stories about people in the past who you never knew, you'll never know because they're dead or whatever, and you're having to picture this other world that you have never experienced firsthand necessarily, because it's all in the past. There's this great book called From What Is to What If, Unleashing the Power of Imagination to Create the Future We Want by Rob Hopkins, which I'll talk about more in a bit. But the book looks at how nowadays people's imaginations are constrained. We are taught not to be imaginative, and in addition to that, stress literally damages the part of your brain that allows you to imagine things. So, in a world where we need more creative solutions for difficult problems than we have ever needed before, we are ending up with a population of people who are finding it more and more difficult to imagine things. I don't know about you, but when I think about times in my life when I have been extremely stressed out, those are times when I didn't even have the mental space to imagine anything at all, really. I couldn't imagine anything getting better in my own life, much less in the world at large. And I think that most people are like that because that's literally how our brains work. But if you have no imagination, then you end up rooted in the here and now, and in the measurable, and you are confined by the restraints that are put around you by the consensus about what reality is, by the powers that be, etc. I'm not saying this in a conspiracy way, I just mean it literally. We're in this society that is ruled by algorithms, where, at least in the US, there's very little political imagination, where in the school systems, we're taught, again in the US, we're taught to standardize tests, where there's literal multiple choice answers, and there's a right answer and a wrong answer, and you just got to fill in the right bubble. You know, so much about our society tells us to stop imagining and stop dreaming and just like accept things the way they are and try your best to not be one of the people who gets screwed, which is like, spoiler alert, most people get screwed, right? So that's a grim reality to live in, and the more you are kind of hammered down by that reality and stressed, the harder it is to imagine anything better. But, like I said, to be interested in history or in the paranormal, you have to be someone who can imagine a world that's different from the one that we're in right now. And that sort of imagination is really valuable, and it's what I want to talk about here. Like I said before, right now we're in a world where pretty much everything is bad. Kind of anywhere you want to look, whether it's the environment or politics or public health or the cost of living, things are somewhat terrible. And the consensus is that things are going to keep getting worse and worse and worse until, I don't know, we die or the world burns up or something. It's grim. It's one of those things, if you look at it too close for too long, you just get sucked in and it's very depressing. So before you get sucked in, what if it were possible for things to get better? Can you even imagine a world where things can get better? And that's kind of a haunting question, right? And I think that's part of what makes solarpunk fiction so powerful, because it's not utopian fiction. It's fiction that looks at a world like ours, where things are kind of screwed up, and thinks about, okay, what would a better future look like? How would you fix some of these things? And I think that's really important, because a lot of people who imagine a better world, including myself often, are just imagining a past world. They're thinking of maybe the 90s or the 60s or whatever other time when they think things were better than they are now. But to quote my Cajun grandparents, there's no such thing as the good old days, and they should know because they grew up in Louisiana without air conditioning and indoor plumbing. We don't need to regress to a previous time when maybe some small number of people might have had things better than they do now, but most people were still struggling. Instead, we can imagine a better future, and I think that's a really important thing to do right now. So let's bring this back to the Mylar balloon. In the paranormal, the Mylar balloon is often something that is meaningful, but as I talked about, in a more realistic sense, Mylar balloons are just the thing that you encounter a lot out and about in nature because people release them without thinking about what kind of damage it's doing. So I could just say that when you think of a Mylar balloon out in the woods, you shouldn't think of synchronicity, you should think about litter and the environment and people being careless, etc. But that's not what I'm saying at all here. Obviously, I think it's important to think about the environment, but it's also incredibly important to think about how things could be improved. And that is way more valuable than just thinking about how bad things are and how they're getting worse, I think. Like, you can't ignore the problems that are going on right now, but it's hard to see any kind of way through this without a little bit of imagination, or, maybe a lot of imagination. So again, I'm not saying any of this to freak anybody out or bum anybody out, but just to say that we're up against a lot, and it's worth pausing and trying to find a way to feel more hopeful about things, because otherwise you just end up miserable and crushed and unable to even imagine a less miserable fate. So I wanted to read a little bit from that book, From What Is to What If by Rob Hopkins, that kind of talks about this. In August 2018, the journalist Will Hutton reported on a new colloquialism being used by doctors in the United States and the United Kingdom to describe, quote, a tangled mix of economic, social, and emotional problems which consists of low mood caused by adverse life circumstances. Shit life syndrome, SLS, as the doctors call it, is when, quote, finding meaning in life is close to impossible. The struggle to survive commands all intellectual and emotional resources. It is not just poverty, but growing relative poverty in an area of rising inequality with all its psychological side effects that is the killer. Although Hutton was primarily describing SLS as an argument against austerity and growing inequality, it seems to describe how an awful lot of people, rich or poor, are feeling these days. Anyway, I really like the idea of imagination as a sort of antidote, or if not antidote, a bit of a path out of this terrible feeling that, yeah, just everything's terrible. Shit life syndrome. And I think that a focus on just the negative without thinking of some other possible positive outcome probably really contributes to that feeling. There's this book called Stitched Up by Tansy E. Hoskins, which is about fashion and its impact on the world and all sorts of stuff. And I wanted to read a little bit from that, which is, I agree with the activist economist Michael Albert, who wrote, our negative or critical messages don't generate anger and action, but only pile up more evidence that the enemy is beyond reach. So that's another thing about how feeling hopeless kind of just disarms you and makes you feel miserable. So I'm not here to offer any kind of specific antidote or put forth any specific philosophy for the future. There are so many different ways of imagining the future, and I think it's worth sitting by yourself and thinking about it and, like walking around the streets of your city and thinking about what your life would be like if it was better, right? Like, I don't know, if you're in a city where you have to drive, maybe you have a long commute to work, maybe you'll find yourself sitting in traffic and you can think, okay, this traffic sucks. What would it be like if I didn't have to sit in traffic? What would that look like? Would it look like there being a high-speed, affordable train in your area that would be able to bring you to the downtown of wherever you live? Would it be that maybe company headquarters aren't all based in crowded downtowns that are far away from where people live? Like, I don't know. There's so many ways you could think about it and approach it, and I would just encourage you in your own life to, when you're doing daily things that are difficult, in particular for systemic reasons, and you're dealing with these things that are making you miserable, it's worth asking yourself, what would it look like if this didn't suck? What would it look like if things turned out okay? And so I want to read another passage from the book, From What Is to What If. It's from the introduction, which is called What If Things Turned Out Okay? And in it, the author goes through his daily life and imagines a day in his life, and he pictures this nice future. And I'll tell you, when I was listening to the audiobook, I was just like, I felt so calm and happy listening to this description of what this person's life could be like. And this is, of course, just a thing to imagine. But I think that once you've imagined what an ideal future would look like, you can look around yourself and say, okay, who in this area or in this community is working to make things sort of in that direction and like change things in that way? And then you know who to work with and who to try to help out and who to organize with, etc. So anyway, to read this passage. I wake well rested in the straw bale walled apartment my family and I call home. Built 15 years ago as part of a sustainable construction initiative throughout our city, the 3-story high apartment complex costs virtually nothing to heat. Its basement hosts composting units for all of the building's toilets, and the solar panels on the roof generate all our electricity needs. I wake my kids, get them dressed and fed, and accompany them to school, a walk that takes us through shared gardens with a diversity of food crops, including young ruby chard whose deep red leaves radiate like stained glass caught in the brilliant sun of this late spring morning. The streets are quiet due to sparse motorized traffic, and they are lined with fruit and nut trees in early blossom. The air smells of spring. Each bus stop we pass is surrounded by a garden on 3 sides, part of the edible bus stop network that now includes most bus stops across the United Kingdom. Anyone can graze while they wait for the bus. In our community, the kids seem to have radically different feelings about school than they did 10 years ago. The education department's decision to eliminate testing, to give ample space for unstructured play, and to provide students with opportunities within the community to acquire meaningful skills that enable them to live happy and healthy lives by their own definition, means that most kids here now love going to school. My son, for example, recently upped his cooking skills by spending a week at a local restaurant. My kids and I approach the school through intensive food gardens planted and managed by the students, and walk into a building where we are greeted by the smell of baking bread and the sound of happy chatter. After we say our goodbyes, I pick up a public bicycle and head into the city on one of our cycle networks. With more bicycles and fewer cars on the road, air quality has improved and public health along with it. I call into my favorite bakery to buy bread. Launched 15 years ago on the premise that baking is the new Prozac, the bakery's mission is to provide meaningful work opportunities for people who lack housing and job security and who struggle with mental health. The bakery prioritizes local produce, grows a thriving rooftop garden, and uses bicycle-powered delivery around town. With the bakery's support, many of its employees have launched other successful businesses across the city. So that's just a little bit from the introduction of this book, but it gives you sort of an example of how you can try to reimagine the world around you and really think through what your life would look like if things were better, you know? And again, this is not an exercise in creating utopia or anything. Any kind of solution would have to be rooted very firmly in the reality that we're in, which is a very difficult one. But even just from a mental health perspective, I find that it really, really helps to look around and be like, okay, if I could change this thing that's difficult, what would it look like? What about this other thing? And then past that, you can think about whether there actually are things you can change, which there probably are in your area. I know for me, especially over the summer during this period where I guess I had some sort of long COVID, which I think I'm still dealing with slightly, but I'm feeling a lot better than I was. Anyway, for me, while I have been dealing with some brain fog and some depression and that sort of thing, it's been really helpful for me to sit down and like draw pictures of what parts of the city could look like in 10 or 20 years or whatever. You know, just little things like street corners in my neighborhood. What might things look like if different systems and infrastructures in the city were improved? And, you know, for me, drawing that out is very therapeutic. For you, it might be writing it or just thinking about it. But it's one of those things where the more I've thought about it, the more I've recognized people already starting to do this sort of thing in my area. So just to give one example that I've talked about extensively last year, in my neighborhood, very close to where I used to live, there is a cemetery called Moore Jackson Cemetery. And when I first moved to that neighborhood, Woodside, the cemetery was just an overgrown, empty lot behind a chain link fence, and no one could access it. It was not really doing anybody any good. It was just a lot, and you could see a couple broken tombstones sticking out of overgrown grass. But then, after I moved out of that neighborhood, some folks in the community got together and were able to convert that cemetery into a community garden. So, of course, there's still the area where people are buried that's kind of in its own spot, kind of in the corner of the plot. But the rest of the lot is this beautiful community garden. And basically anyone from the community can just come and sit in the garden. They can help do yard work in the garden. And in return, you can, have some of the crops that are grown there or the flowers. And there's all sorts of events that are held there. And it's just a really nice thing in the neighborhood. I live in New York City. People don't really, for the most part, have yards. And there is something relaxing about being able to help grow things and maybe even getting some of the stuff that you helped grow, and being able to eat this food that you grew. And, that was an idea that somebody or some people had. For 4 years, I walked by that empty lot every day, and saw the tombstones because it was right by the subway. And for 4 years, all I thought was, man, too bad that's overgrown. But somebody else in the neighborhood was thinking, wow, wouldn't it be cool if that was a community garden and it was full of flowers and anyone could go hang out there and it could grow food for folks in the neighborhood and all of this stuff. Like somebody had this great idea and turned it into something really cool. So I know that a community garden in Queens is a far cry from like finding a solution to all the systemic issues in the world that are making our lives increasingly difficult, of course, but it is this little spot of hope and it is this thing that just makes it nicer to live here. You know, I don't live super close to Moore Jackson Cemetery anymore, but you know, it's a reasonable walk away from here and I love walking by, especially on a spring or summer weekend and seeing all the people in the park and going in and looking at the cemetery and looking at all the things that are being grown, and it's just really nice. And I think everybody deserves to have nice things in their lives. And also I think that the more things that there are that give us hope and the more things that there are that encourage us to imagine things being better, the more we get that ability to imagine. And I think that small actions within a community do snowball, and like small improvements to folks' quality of life have a really big impact. So while I don't have solutions, hopefully I've at least given a couple examples of what it means to imagine things being better than they are now. And now that I've talked about all of this and the possibility of what I kind of think of as forgotten futures, this idea of there being able to be a better future, which I think we have sort of lost in a lot of ways. Now that I've talked about all of this, I hope that when you see a Mylar balloon, sure, you might think about synchronicity and all the things that it could represent in the paranormal. And yeah, maybe it makes you think of littering, etc., and the issue of the trash that haunts all of us. But even more so, I hope that you might be able to use it as a trigger to remind yourself to think about how things could be better. Because again, the more we suppress our imagination and the more we tell ourselves that things can't improve, the more screwed over we are. And if we humans have any hope of improving the state of things, we have to have the courage and imagination to envision a world where things are better. And that means being able to see beyond what governments and corporations and the hegemonic structures of our world tell us is the only option. So again, when it comes to Mylar balloons, I'd like to challenge you to use them as a prompt to pause and think about what sort of forgotten future you'd like to reclaim and what sorts of what-ifs you'd like to dream into being. Anyway, this is something I'm thinking a lot about and something that I'm planning to explore a little bit more in a future episode, but I wanted to at least get this conversation started. I would love to hear people's thoughts about this topic because, like I said, I've been thinking about it a lot lately. And for me, just finding a way to imagine a future in which not everything is completely screwed up has been an important part of my mental health maintenance, I guess you would call it. I've read kind of a lot of books about this topic this year, so I'm planning to put together a list of some of those books in case anyone's curious. I'll probably include that with the show notes of the next episode I do, kind of tied in with this topic. But in the meantime, if you're looking for some places where you can find more positive visions of the future, check out From What Is to What If by Rob Hopkins. Check out the Monk and Robot series by Becky Chambers, which starts with A Psalm for the Wild Built. I also think that her book, Record of a Spaceborne Few, which is part of another series that's more of like a space opera series, is really good and envisions a really interesting future for humans, like out in space. So check that out if space operas are your thing. And if you're looking for a YouTube channel that you can watch that talks about some of this stuff, I really enjoy videos by the YouTuber Andrewism. That's where I heard about this book, From What Is to What If, and I find the channel very relaxing to watch because unlike many YouTube channels, which have like a very rapid fire pace, the pace of these videos are a little bit more slower and steady and relaxing. So I find it very soothing, both in terms of the subject matter and just the way the information is presented. So Andrewism is another thing to check out if you are into YouTube videos. Oh, and I guess I also really enjoy Cory Doctorow's podcast. Cory Doctorow is a very famous sci-fi author and journalist who writes a lot about technology and that sort of thing. So if you're more of a techie person, that's definitely worth checking out. Not every episode is positive necessarily, but he is someone with an eye to imagining how things could be better and how things could be improved, not just pointing out all the ways that things are bad. I think that podcast is just called like the Cory Doctorow podcast. If you Google it, it'll come up. So with that, I think that's everything I have to say this time. I know this was a little bit different from my usual episodes. I, of course, have some of my usual stuff percolating and on the docket, so keep an eye out for that. And again, I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this topic. Oh, and before I sign off, I apologize if there was radiator noise in the background of this episode. It's October in New York City, which means it's radiator season between now and, I don't know, March or so. And I am recording in the room with the quietest radiator, but you probably just heard it bang behind me. I'm doing my best. Thank you for bearing with me. Every room in the apartment has a radiator, which is great in terms of us not freezing, but terrible in terms of recording. So I'll try to get as much of the sound out as I can for this episode and the rest of the episodes this winter. Anyway, if you want to check out the show notes for this episode, they are at buriedSecretsPodcast.com. You can email me at buriedSecretsPodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. And thanks so much for listening.